大家如果想看我很傻的一个视频，可以到网上去看一下。I was very, very nervous in the live show. I remember at the time to go on national TV, it was real time, and you told me we had to make sure that it had a very low risk of failure. So, but the problem was the machine always crashed.
Yeah.
So we came up with a way to reduce failure. We brought 2 computers. Remember
Right.
that? Yeah. And then if there was a disaster, they would switch over. But fortunately, it worked well. But you were always a great leader and inspiration to me even to today, because I'm now following your profession to help young people in China. But I think in this forum, I know that this is sort of the Steve Jobs fan club in China, because he's the inspiration to the many young product managers and young CEOs. So if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you maybe a few questions about Steve. I wasn't able to work directly with Steve. I worked for you from 1990 to 96. And many people ask me, and I say I worked at Apple. They say, well, you must know Steve Jobs. And I would say, no, I worked at Apple between jobs, which was what I did. But Steve, when he left Apple, there was a conflict between you and him, and the board decided that he would not get what he wants, so he ultimately left. I always wonder whether it would have been better for him to have stayed or not. You have told some people that things might have worked out and that you regret the way the things turned out. But I always wonder, Steve was quite immature, maybe somewhat incorrigible at the time. And I always wonder if, had he stayed at Apple, could he and you, or maybe just him, take an Apple to the greatness and become the visionary that he ultimately was? Or did he really have to get fired, learn his tough life lessons in order to hit bottom and grow from failure? What were your thoughts about that?
Well, Kaifu, I came from corporate America, and we knew nothing about the concept of founders. There were no founders in corporate America. These companies had been founded sometimes 50, 100 years earlier. So I had little perspective of how important a founder was. And I believe that founders need to be given more latitude, even make mistakes. I believe that the Apple board, because they were all from Silicon Valley, I think they could have done a better job of not demoting Steve, but figuring out, how could John and Steve work together? Because what people don't realize, we weren't just business associates. We were best friends. We spent all of our time together. We shared everything about our ideas and secrets of life. And so it was a wrenching emotional experience when Steve and I broke up. It wasn't just like 2 business people breaking up. And I think in hindsight, there could have been a solution, because I didn't want his job. I wasn't trying to be the visionary of Apple. He founded Apple, and I think there could have been a solution. The reality was that there's some things that nobody can control. And the reality was that technology was just not powerful enough, Moore's Law, to be able to do the things back in 1985 that Steve had visions to do. So when he left Apple, he went and started a new company called Next. And while he argued with me about the price being too high for the Macintosh Office, when he introduced Next, he made the price even higher. And Next failed. And while it failed, in the beginning, the technology that he chose actually was a very good choice. And one of Steve's greatest talents was his ability to recruit talent. And he recruited great talent at Apple. He recruited great talent at Next. Years later, as Moore's Law became possible for computers to actually do powerful things, Steve had been correct in the technology he chose at Next. And when he came back to Apple, he came back and brought the Next operating system with him. And by that time, Moore's Law computers were powerful enough And of course, we saw what Steve was able to do with that. So he was always a genius. He was a founder with imperfections. We all have imperfections. He was a young person making mistakes, but he was like no one else on the planet. Yeah, he had vision, he had passion, he had charisma, and fortunately for the world and for Apple, eventually, Steve did come back, and of course we know all the things that he accomplished in his life.
Do you think a great visionary like him, or who's had just too much early on success and maybe he needs to have a little bit of failure in order to learn humility, or what do you think he learned from that?
I think so. I think humility is painful. Steve said that this was the most painful moment in his life when he was pushed out of Apple. And he went through some dark years after that. Next didn't succeed. He started with Pixar. He bought from George Lucas for $12 million. In the beginning, it didn't succeed. Steve was running out of money. And it wasn't clear what his future was going to be. And yet, his vision was always strong. It was always right. And he turned out, in the end, to be correct with Pixar and changed the world of entertainment. And he was obviously correct in what he did at Apple. But the Steve Jobs, who you all remember, was a much older man. He was wise. He became the most famous and successful CEO in the world. He had matured. And on many occasions, Steve said that the best lessons he ever had were the lessons in those dark years where he had to mature as an individual. And he came back, obviously, you know, a very, very different person when he returned at Apple 15 years later.
Yeah, I think Steve is a role model to probably the great majority of people here. But one of the dangers is to try to copy a role model, because many of Steve's brilliant characteristics are innate to him and maybe not copyable. So to help the audience, can you suggest maybe a few things that Steve does well that could actually be learned, that could benefit people here?
Well, one thing that may surprise people in this audience, because Steve was such a charismatic presenter, when he would launch a product, he would make it look so easy. Everything seemed spontaneous. But I can tell you, because I was with him on many occasions, he sweated every detail. He practiced, he rehearsed every line, everything that seemed spontaneous, that just was, oh, and one more thing. Every word was carefully calculated by Steve. So no one worked harder than Steve Jobs to make it look easy. And of course, no one was more persuasive than Steve to be inspiring as a result. So I would say that hard work, never giving up, were characteristics that were innate to Steve Jobs. He also sacrificed a lot in his personal life. Many people don't realize that Steve never cared about making money. When Steve and I were very close friends, I would go to his house. He had almost no furniture in his house. He had a small bed. He had a picture of Einstein on the wall. He had another picture on the wall of Mahatma Gandhi. He had one Tiffany lamp. That was it. There was nothing else in his house. He didn't care about material things. But he did care passionately that the Mac had to be perfect in every way. And I'll tell you one other story, which may be a surprise. The Macintosh was a locked case. It was almost impossible to get inside of the original Mac unless you had a special tool. And the reason for that is that Steve didn't want anybody modifying the Mac. He said he wanted to be in control of the user experience, the technology. He didn't want people putting boards inside the Mac. And I remember just before we were getting ready to introduce the first Macintosh, Kaifu, and the motherboard did not look perfect to Steve. He said, I want it relaid out again. And one of the engineers, Burl Smith, who was running hardware, said, Steve, nobody's ever going to know. The motherboard's going to be inside of the locked case. They'll never know. And Steve said, I'll know. He said, I'll know. And this was an example of how determined he was about perfection.
Right. I think earlier you also mentioned the focus on recruiting, right? The many people you mentioned, Alan Kay, Bill Atkinson, and including you. You heard his, probably he spent the most time with the story about sugar water that you told. I think that's something people could learn from. I also just mentioned to you that Steve had given, given me a call after he came back to Apple. I was not there.
Yeah.
And he called and my wife answered. At the time, I just got an offer from Microsoft and accepted. And I told my wife, this is a secret. I haven't decided to go or not. Please don't tell anybody. And then one day I came home and my wife said, you got a call from Steve Jobs. And I told him you're going to Microsoft. And I said, I barely know Steve Jobs. How could you say that? And my wife said, well, he's so charismatic and friendly. Felt like you were good friends, so I just told him everything. So.
Well, I think you all know that Kaifu Lee is a Silicon Valley rock star. He's a China rock star. Everything that he's ever been involved with has been something that has changed the world. So it is such a privilege to have you as a friend and to be here together with you on this stage. And Steve Jobs knew Kaifu was a rock star. So that's so typical of Steve. He'd never met Kaifu before. It was many years after you had left Apple, I had left Apple, and Steve Jobs sought Kaifu out, as he usually did, and he would make those calls personally to recruit brilliant people like Kaifu Lee.
Yeah, that's something I think all the CEOs can learn from, to spend a lot of time on recruiting. One other thing you mentioned is about the founder culture. I think Apple had a hard time not having its founder. So as a result, many VCs, especially in China, now believe that once you invest in the company, you're basically making a full bet on the founder. And I think a few cases where the Chinese VCs forced the board forced the founder out, it didn't end well. Do you think that's generally the advice?
Well, as I was saying earlier, Kaifu, that when I came from corporate America, we knew nothing about founders. And I am a complete believer that founders are special. You have to give founders more leeway to try things, make mistakes. You have to be more forgiving for founders, because founders are the ones who can do things that no professional manager can. So I would agree that the founder is so important that when I make investments, there are many, many smart people. The big surprise to people when they show up in Silicon Valley, they say, well, I was valedictorian at my university, so I must be pretty smart. Well, guess what? Everybody was a valedictorian at their university in Silicon Valley. So being smart is not enough. There are far more smart people in Silicon Valley than there are successful companies. And so I'm a big believer that founders are fundamental to the success of a company. And so it means you've got to recruit carefully. When I invest, I'm less interested in investing in a great idea. I'm much more interested in investing in someone who can be a founder and who can have a vision and can inspire other people, talented people, to join them and be part of their team. So I agree, the founder is incredibly important and unique.
Right. Okay, so a final question for you, maybe a little sentimental one, is I know that you and Steve had some hard times and really didn't have a chance to reconnect and speak your mind with him. If there was a time machine that could take us back 5 years and that you could look him in the eye and see him again, what would you say to him?
The longer I live, the more I look back with a great deal of admiration and a great deal of privilege to have been such a close personal friend and to have worked with Steve Jobs. And if I could say something to say goodbye to him, and I didn't, we didn't talk again, I would have said, Steve, you told me you were going to change the world, and you did. Steve, you sacrificed many things in your life, not to make money, not to live the glamorous life of wealth, even though you were, but you did what you used to tell me. You said you were going to put a dent in the universe. And Steve Jobs put a dent in the universe. Many people don't know this, but one of the companies that I co-founded, called Misfit, we just sold the company in December. Founded it with Sonny Vu, a friend of mine from MIT, originally from Vietnam.
Sonny was my intern at Microsoft.
Oh, you're kidding.
I don't know if he told you that.
I didn't know that. Well, Sonny Vu and I became great friends, and we founded a company called Misfit. And the day we founded it was October 5th, 2011. October 5th, 2011 was the day that Steve Jobs died. And we were trying to think of the name of the company. And so we said, let's call it Misfit.
Oh.
And people say, why did you call it Misfit? And we said, because Steve Jobs wrote a famous commercial when he came back to Apple. And he said, we are the misfits. We are the round pegs in the square holes. You know, we are the ones who are different. We are the misfits. So we named the company we founded on the day that Steve Jobs, after Steve Jobs. So my whole life, I will always have admiration and wonderful feelings about Steve Jobs. Even though we, as best friends, had a falling out, I will never forget the things that he accomplished and the chance that I had the privilege to be able to be his friend and to work with him.
Right. The Misfit commercial ends with the saying that the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world
yes,
are those
we are
who
the
do.
crazy ones, Steve would say. We are the crazy ones.
Right.
We're the
right.
misfits.
That's really great. I think we're a bit out of time, but I really appreciate your graciousness and your inspiration and your great thoughts. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Kaifu.